Hello everyone, Mr. Geiselhart here, and we're going to take a look at the graphs of sine and cosine. This is for Chapter 4, homework sign number 11, more graphing with sine and cosine. One of the things we have to be able to do is describe a graph using words, and so we have to describe the position of that graph. To do that, we're going to start off by using a couple of different terms. The first term is going to be the middle of the graph. Now, the middle of the graph is just where horizontally does that line follow, that it's the same distance when you go up to the max or go down to the minimum value. So in this case, the middle of the graph is just the x-axis, or at 0. Then the next thing we're going to take a look at is something called the amplitude. Now, the amplitude is from the middle, how high does it go to the max, or how low does it go to the minimum? So in this case, for both sine and cosine, the middle is at 0 and the amplitude is at 1. The next thing we want to know is something called the period. The period is just how long does it take for a graph to repeat itself. So if I start at 0, 0 for the sine graph and I follow along the graph, I reach a maximum there, 0 there, reach a minimum there, and then I'm back here at 0. That is one complete period of this. If I were to continue on, it would just continue the same pattern. So the period is 2 pi. Notice that cosine will have the same period. The only difference is instead of starting at 0, I'm going to start at the maximum. So it will repeat at the maximum there. The last thing we're going to talk about is called the shift. Now, the shift is not something you see in these graphs because there's none added to that. So a shift would be how far from the original graph of sine or cosine would this be moved either to the right or to the left. And we'll talk more about that in just a couple of minutes. Okay, in this graph, what you'll see is we added the number 3 up in front of the sine. If you look at the graph, that will just move each point on the graph up 3 units. So every spot on this graph gets moved up 3 units, including the middle of the graph. So if the middle of the graph was right here, that gets moved up 3 units. So if I start at 0, it'll go up 1, 2, 3. So now the middle of my graph is at 3 and not at 0. So that's how that changes. If this were a negative number out in front of the 3, that would just move it down 3 units instead of moving it up 3 units. So that would be the difference between the negative and positive. But that number there tells you the middle. In this case, the middle is 3. Okay, so I turned off the graph of 3 plus sine x, and now I turned on the graph of 2 sine x. Now, the 2, if it's multiplied by sine, that 2 number there is going to tell you how high and how low it goes. In other words, the amplitude. So now we're going to be looking at the amplitude. In this case, it has an amplitude of 2. So that just means from the middle of the graph, how high up will I go? So the new graph, the purple one, goes up 2 and down 2 units. When we're talking about the amplitude, we say that it will just be 2. Now, the amplitude is an absolute value. It's always positive because I'm looking from the distance from the middle. So you'll never have a negative amplitude. The next thing we're going to look at is the period. Remember, the period is how long will it take for it to repeat itself. In this case, the period for the new graph, well, let's figure it out. Remember, the original graph, I'm going to do in green. The original graph didn't repeat itself till it got to 2 pi. This period, if I do this in yellow, this one repeats itself after just pi. So I say the period is going to be pi. And I'll explain how that number 2 relates to the period in the next video. And the last one we're going to take a look at is the shift. Now, in the shift here, I'm going to go ahead, and these are pretty close. So I'm going to start with my original graph and just kind of outline my original graph. It's going to look something like that. Now, when this says negative pi over 4 here, that means I shift it pi over 4 to the right. So every place has moved over pi over 4 units. So all we did is just slid it over a little bit. And again, in the next part of this video, I'll explain exactly how that works. Okay, so let's take a look and see what it looks like all together. When we graph everything at once, we start with the middle. Now the middle of my graph is going to be 3. So I'm going to just draw that in right there. The amplitude is going to be 2. So I go up 2 units and down 2 units. The period is going to be pi. So if I start here and I follow the graph, it'll repeat it after pi units. So from there to there is pi. And then the last thing is the phase shift. So notice that sine starts off at 0, 0 and goes up to there. So if I just find the first place that sine is at 0, 0, that tells, or is at 0 on the y-axis, that just tells me where I need to go. So in this case, it's exactly pi over 4 units. So I started off at 0 in the middle. So here, 0 in the middle is just going to be pi over 4 units. And again, I'll explain that a little bit more in the next part of the video. Okay, now this is where we're really going to look at how the equation relates to the middle, the amplitude, the period, and the shift. So the first thing I want to do is just kind of go through this one thing at a time. So the first thing I'm going to start with is D. Whatever D is, that tells you where the middle of the graph is. Now, the amplitude, or A, is just going to be the absolute value of A. So it doesn't matter whether this is a plus or a minus when you have it in there for the amplitude. It won't change the amplitude at all because we're just doing an absolute value. So amplitude should never be negative. Now, period. Period is just equal to 2 pi over B. So in the previous example, we said the period was pi, but we said that B was 2. So the way we do that is we do 2 pi divided by B, which is 2, and that gives me a period of pi. So your period is always equal to 2 pi divided by B. And the shift is always just going to be C, whatever that is. Now, the thing we need to make sure we know is that when this is negative, that means it's to the right. If this were positive, that means you shift to the left. So negative right, positive left. Okay, we're going to take a look at 4-11 homework now. This happens to be number 5. And when we're doing this, what we really want to do is we want to go ahead and find the middle, the amplitude, the period, and the shift. So what we're going to do is if we look over here, this tells us how to get all these numbers. So the first thing I'm going to do is find the middle. The middle is just the D value, so the number out in front, so my middle is going to be 4. My amplitude is just the number A, or the letter A, which is just in front of the sine or cosine. It doesn't matter whether it's positive or negative, because amplitude is an absolute value, so my amplitude is going to be 1. Then if I want to find my period, if I take 2 pi and divide it by B, that gives me my period. In this case, it would be pi over 4. And then my shift. My shift is just the number here. Now, remember, when that's a plus, my shift is to the left, which means I have a shift of negative pi over 8. So now let's take a look at how do we do this in our graph. Well, the first thing we have to do is determine whether we're going to use a sine or a cosine graph. What we're going to want to do is look down here. There's 2 different types of graphs. You should always use the right one for sine and use the left one for cosine. Since this is sine, I'm going to want to make sure that I have that one checked, which it is. Now, the next thing I want you to do is if you look at these red dots, I know they're really little close and they're close together, but these red dots here for cosine are exactly 1/2 of a period apart. If I look at these 2 dots for sine, they're exactly 1/4 of a period apart. So what I'm going to have to do is figure out how far apart am I going to need to put these dots. Because it's 1/4 of a period, what I need to do is I need to multiply my period by 1/4, and that will tell me how far I need to go over to make my next mark. So that ends up being pi over 16. So now that we have all that done, we're ready to actually try graphing this. So the first thing I want to do is my middle. My middle is at 4, so that means I'm going to have to go up 4 units. My shift is negative pi over 8. So since sine starts in the middle, that means I'm going to go here for my first spot. Now, notice that that's up 4 units from where it would normally be, and it's back pi over 8. The next thing we said is that we're going to have, I have to move over pi over 16 units. Now, normally, sine goes up when we start, but because we have a negative sign in our equation, we actually have to go down before we start. So because this sign here is negative, I go down instead of up when I make my graph. So my next point is going to have to be pi over 16 units down, which is going to be right here. Now, let's double check everything and make sure that we got everything correct. The first thing I'm going to take a look at is my middle. If I have my middle drawn in, my middle's right here, and that looks like the middle. The next thing I want to take a look is my amplitude. I have an amplitude of 1 unit, so I'm going up 1 and I'm going down 1. So my amplitude looks good. A period of pi over 4. So I'm going to start at 0, 0 here, and if I follow this graph, notice that it repeats again there at pi over 4. So my period is pi over 4, and from the start, did I move backwards pi over 8? And I moved backwards pi over 8. So this all looks good to me, so let's go ahead and check the answer and make sure we got it right. So when I submit that question, oh, it is right. It just hasn't changed since the last time. So that is the correct answer. Okay, now let's take a look at another one. This happens to be number 8, and this one happens to be a cosine one. So the first thing we want to do is find our middle, our amplitude, our period, and our shift. So let's go ahead and start with our middle. The middle is just the number that is added or subtracted. So the d value, the one out in front, that's just 4. The amplitude is the number right in front of sine or cosine, so that will be 3. And again, we always want it to be positive, so we don't call that negative 3. The period is just 2 pi divided by our b value. Our b value here is pi over 4. Now, if I want to simplify this, I'm going to first clear the fraction by multiplying the top and bottom both by 4, which will give me 8 pi over pi. Then the pi's cancel out, and I'm left with a period of 8, because remember, that's my b value. My c value here, now remember, if it's negative, that means I shift it to the right, which means my shift is a positive 2. Now, because this is cosine, we have to make sure that we are choosing the right type of graph. Remember, the one on the right is for sine, the one on the left is for cosine. Also, remember that these two dots here in cosine are exactly half the period apart. When you're doing sine, they're only 1/4 of the period apart. Since we're doing cosine, I have to figure out what is the distance that is half a period, so I know where to make my next point. So if my period equals 8, I have to do half of that, so I need to multiply by 1/2, which means my period is equal to, or which means 4. So that means I'm going to have to move 4 units in between my two dots. Now, the other thing that we need to know is that when we're looking at just the graph of y equals cosine of x, it starts off at a maximum. Now, in this case, it starts off at a maximum of 1, so it'll be at the point 0, 1, which is a maximum. Now, because in this case, my cosine is negative, it actually starts at a minimum at 0. So y equals negative cosine of x will really start at 0, negative 1, which is my minimum. So what I need to do here is I need to figure out what will my minimum value be. Well, if my middle is equal to 4 and my amplitude is equal to 3, I just take my middle, subtract the amplitude, and that gives me my minimum. So I have a minimum at 1, and then I need to say where am I going to shift to. So I don't want to start where x is equal 0. I want to start where x is equal to 2 because that's where my shift is. So my first point is going to be at 2, 1, and that's going to be a minimum value. Now, the next spot I'm going to point is going to be my maximum value. To find the maximum value, I just take the middle and I add the amplitude. So if I do that, I'll do 4 plus 3, so my maximum will be at 7. So I'm going to have to go up to 7 for my next one. Now, to make that point, I have to figure out what half the period is. Well, half the period is 4, so I have to go over 4 units to 6 and up to my maximum, which is 7. So it should look like this. Now let's double check everything. The first thing I want to do is take a look at my middle. So my middle right here is at 4, and that looks good. My amplitude is 3. So I went up 3 units here, and I go down 3 units here. The next one is my period. Well, if I start here, and I go 1 full period, that's going to put me right there, and that's going to make it 8, which is what we want our period to be, and a shift of 2. So normally when it was negative cosine, I would have started here, but I shifted 2 units there. So let's just kind of double check then and see if we actually got the right answer. So let's submit this, and that looks good. It looks like we did get the right answer there.